Warning.
Dans ce nouveau monde, on doit accepter une transparence, et je dirais même une transparence totale. Tout va être transparent. Et il faut s'habituer, il faut se comporter ainsi. Ça devient, comment dirais-je, intégré dans votre personnalité, mais si on n'a rien à cacher, il ne faut pas avoir peur.
We're going to Canada. Make some attempt to liberate it non-violently.
Yes.
It deserves to live in freedom and peace and not in rapid, disgusting decline. What kind of reception do you think we'll get in Canada?
There are people who really do desire the truth and understand what's at stake.
But if we show up and announce we're here to liberate Canada, what do you think will happen?
Well, their hair is going to start on fire and they're going to freak.
And I was suggesting we bomb Belgrade. I was suggesting that we send American pilots in and blow up all the bridges on the Drina. I was suggesting we take out his oil supplies.
In '99, when we had bombings, as you mentioned, we did live in the apartment that is about 500 feet away from here. We would come always to this.
With Senator Biden, do you believe that, as Anho suggested, we're talking about jobs that Americans won't do? That's often used as a conversation point in this debate over immigration.
Let's get straight. Americans will do any job if you pay them properly. You know, the fact of the matter is, that doesn't mean we don't need guest workers. We do. That doesn't mean we don't need, but we should base the number of guest workers that are in the statute that we're trying to pass, and we tried to pass before comprehensive immigration reform, based upon need, not on an absolute number. And we should require employers to offer those jobs to citizens to see if they want those jobs. Case in point, you had Swift Meats down in North Carolina. INS came in, 800 people took off. The fact of the matter is they had to go out and hire people. Guess what? They had to double the wage and provide health insurance. They got all the North Carolinians they want to come and slit pigs' throats, which no one wants to do. They did it. And so that doesn't mean there's not room. We need agricultural workers. We need H-1B visas. We need what, in fact, exists as a need, not as an artificial number to allow employers to drive down wages.
Well, earlier in this panel, it was suggested that hiring illegal immigrants to do these jobs doesn't drive down wages. So I'm interested to hear this anecdotal evidence.
It drives down wages. I think it drove down wages at Swift Meats. What happened? When 800 out of 2,800 people left, they had to go out and say, okay, now we'll pay $10.50 an hour instead of $6 an hour, or whatever the number was. And we're going to give health insurance. And guess what? North Carolinians showed up for the jobs. Now, granted, the rate that they dropped the job is about 57% versus 46%. I know it's your home state, John, but I mean, that's what happened. There's a lot of people who will go out and hang drywall and get a decent wage. There are not a lot of people who are going to go out and do the agricultural work that's seasonal. So it should be based on need.
President Bush is right to be concerned about Saddam Hussein's relentless pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, and the possibility that he may use them or share them with terrorists. Other regimes hostile to the United States and our allies already have or seek to acquire weapons of mass destruction.
This was Joe Biden in 2002, speaking as chair of the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. A few months later, when the Senate was debating whether to give President George W. Bush the authority to start a war with Iraq, Biden argued strongly in favor of granting this authority.
The objective is to compel Iraq to destroy its illegal weapons of mass destruction and its programs to develop and produce missiles and more of those weapons. Saddam is dangerous. The world would be a better place without him. But the reason he poses a growing danger to the United States and its allies is that he possesses chemical and biological weapons and is seeking nuclear weapons. And unlike my colleague from West Virginia and Maryland, I do not believe this is a rush to war. I believe it's a march to peace and security. I believe that failure to overwhelmingly support this resolution is likely to enhance the prospects that war will occur.
Joe Biden did so.
We all agree on the need to better secure the border and to punish employers who choose to hire illegal immigrants. We are a generous and welcoming people here in the United States, but those who enter the country illegally and those who employ them disrespect the rule of law, and they are showing disregard for those who are following the law. We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked, and circumventing the line of people who are waiting patiently, diligently, and lawfully to become immigrants in this country.
I'd like to acknowledge that gender or the binary is specifically a European colonial construct. Indigenous people who occupied Turtle Island, and in this specific area, that would be the Niitsitapi, the Tsuut'ina, and the Yahe Nakota, as well as the Métis, were in Nation 3 or Region 3. Those folks acknowledged and valued what we call gender diversity today. So when we're talking about the context of the work that we're doing today, it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the barriers to care or transphobia were specifically imported and from Europe, and they were non-existent before colonial contact. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but it's really important to acknowledge that it wasn't until colonial contact that the binary, or the idea of only two genders, was introduced and enforced. And it was a part of colonial genocide, and a really huge part of residential schools was conforming people to the two gender roles that they had to occupy.
The Kentucky legislature overrode the governor's veto of a bill that restricts aspects of trans youth gender affirming care and the use of bathrooms. I know that the White House released a proclamation for Trans Day of Visibility. There is a march happening tomorrow to commemorate this day, but also to protest these type of bills that are continuing to be passed and advanced in legislatures across the country. What is the White House's message to these lawmakers that are passing these bills and to those who are taking to the streets to protest them?
So look, first of all, we support peaceful protest.
We think it's important for Americans and people just across the country to make their voices heard, just as long as it's peaceful. And we've been very clear about these anti-LGBTQ bills that we're seeing in state legislatures across the country, in particular these anti-trans bills, as they attack trans kids, as they attack trans parents. It is shameful and it is unacceptable. As you mentioned, tomorrow's Trans Visibility Day, on a day that we should be lifting up our trans kids, our trans youth, and making sure that they feel seen. We're seeing more and more of these hateful bills. And that's what Republicans want to spend their time on. They don't want to talk about lowering costs. They don't want to talk about actually making Americans' lives better. They want to take away people's freedoms. And one of the things that we saw during the midterm elections is that people don't want their freedoms to be taken. They want us to fight for their freedoms. And so it is shameful, it is disturbing, and our hearts go out to the trans community as they are under attack right now. But this is a president who has said many times before he has their backs. He will continue to have their backs, and he will continue to fight for them. And his record shows.
So here's when Glenn Greenwald stuck it to Bill Maher, and he was never invited back
Our
out.
fault what came out. We didn't go into Egypt.
Well, we
wound up with the Muslim Brotherhood.
We didn't go into Egypt. We were supporting and propping up Mubarak for 30 years, even as we were cheering for all the Tahrir Square demonstrators as though we were on their side. It was our government that kept Mubarak in power, just like we've done across the entire Muslim world. And it's amazing for you to say that, well, look at all these Muslims. The minute you give them a little bit of freedom, they go wild and they start being all violent. How can you be a citizen of the United States, the country that has generated more violence and militarism in the world over the last 5 or 6 decades, and say, look at those people over there, they are incredibly violent? We play a significant role in what has been happening in the Middle East because we've been interfering and dominating that region in order to have access to the oil.
I wasn't talking about violence. I was talking about theocracy. That doesn't happen here.
No, well, okay, that doesn't happen here, but at the same time, Iran isn't invading lots of other countries and occupying them for a decade, nor are fundamentalist Muslim countries the way the United States is. So these things are interlinked because we are continuously interfering in that part of the world. And so to say...
Really, it's all our fault?
It's not all our fault, but when you send your military for 6 straight decades into other countries to bomb them, kill their children and women and innocent men, prop up dictators, yeah, you take responsibility for your actions and say, to the extent that that region...
That religion goes back 1,000 years before our revolution, so I don't think we can take all the blame.
I don't think we should. I think we should take a lot of it. And there's lots of bodies and corpses that have been piled up in the name of Christianity and Judaism as well.
Not recently.
Have you heard of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza for the last 50 years, motivated in part by extremist views of Judaism, or the wars in Europe, or the fact that there were generals in the United States saying we have to go and invade and destroy Iraq, a country of 26 million people, because our God is bigger? Lots of religions, not just Islam, produce violence.
Well, if I could just make one quick point about Egypt.
That silly liberal view that all religions are alike because it makes you feel good.
No, it makes you feel good to say our side is better than people over there.
No, it makes you feel good to put a crown on your head and say, I'm a good person. How do I prove that?
You get to ignore the responsibility that your own government has for the violence and instability in the world by saying, look, it's that primitive religion over there that's to blame.
All right, it's time for...
Okay. So that's Bill Maher doing mental gymnastics, and boy, he's a fucking Olympian.
And when you look at the characteristics of all cults, they all have the same things in common. The people who push the cult, they self-police their own thoughts. They won't allow themselves to look at the truth, because if they were to do that, they would lose their entire social circle, and it would upset what they've believed so fervently for all of these years. Most people can't confront that in the moment. That's why it's important to say things they agree with and ask them questions to get them thinking, because nobody ever comes out of a cult on their own just because you told them that they were wrong. They have to come out of it after, over the years, they start to question this themselves. Those doubts start to creep in, and one day they finally get to a point where they're willing to take that leap and leave it. But this is absolutely a cult. Gender identities don't exist. Personalities exist. And we need to get back to reality. There's no such thing as being transgender. Transition is something you do. It's not something you are. And if an adult wants to do this, that's a different conversation. But we still have all these 18 and 19-year-olds who just a few years later say, what the heck did you do to me? Because they'd suffered abuse or trauma. Sexual abuse is extremely common. I talked to Dr. Quentin Van Meter last week. He's a pediatrician with the American College of Pediatricians. Those are the good pediatricians. And he thinks that sexual abuse is prevalent in about 60% of these cases. So there's always something else going on, which we should be screening for and treating first. We should be treating the mental health comorbidities first, not treating gender as though it's the source of all their underlying problems.
Mm-hmm. Oh my, it's just so dark to think of these poor girls in particular without their body parts, without their ability to have children, nurse a child, and even the absence of estrogen. You know, I mean, that really does change your experience in life. It changes the way your hair is, the way your skin is. You know, ask any postmenopausal woman who doesn't go on HRT. It's a natural life process, but it definitely brings on a lot of change that is insane to put on a 16-year-old who doesn't need it, who's been just confused by a family divorce or a sexual abuse situation. And all of that goes unaddressed because we've decided to focus on something completely unrelated, this gender dysphoria that isn't really the cause of her problems. All right, stand by, Chris. I'm going to take a quick break. There's much more to discuss, including I'd love to get your backstory, because wait until you hear how Chris got into this. The reason we call him Billboard Chris is fascinating. Stand by. We'll be right back.
I think people underestimate to what extent privileged, especially white women, are willing to sacrifice their children for the altar of status. For them, having a trans kid is like winning the lottery, right? And you laugh, but it's really the case. It's very disturbing. They're the only ones bringing their kids to drag shows because for these affluent white female liberals, awfuls, a man in makeup is like the second coming. And, you know, they're showing dad or their husband or whoever how enlightened they are because this is what corporate media tells them. So they can't wait to bring their kids and show how with the program they are. So they are a menace. And this, in my opinion, is Munchausen's by proxy. You know, they're torturing their kids for the sake of status and accolades.
And that's because we are hurting and we join our communities, the most marginalized communities and vulnerable communities through this process. As we just came out of the Senate floor that passed HB 257 and HB 261, and they're moving really fast to get to the governor's desk.
You know, this whole transgender sports topic, one of the things I hear a lot is why aren't these women standing up, these female athletes? I got a DM over the weekend from one LPGA golfer currently on the tour who is responding to the biological male who won a women's tournament last weekend. And she said, there's a lot of people on the tour that feel the same way, but they're scared of losing sponsors. And she said that that's the problem. They're struggling financially, either don't have a sponsor and are looking for one, or have a sponsor and are afraid that the sponsors are then going to dump them for standing up for their own sport. So I see that. I see the fear in these women. My question is, what can we do? What can we do to help them feel more secure, to help them financially maybe, so they can stand up? Because I agree, it's probably the only way. But right now they feel stuck. And I understand that fear. I want to help. Like, what should we do?
Hi, TikTok. My name's Rory, and I'm a detransitioner. I'm 23 years old, and I'm about 3 months off of estrogen, which I took for 4 years. I was what you would have called true trans. I presented with dysphoria for most of my childhood. Into early adulthood, I had this very sudden, very strong realization that I was just denying my reality, and it quickly became untenable for me to continue taking hormones.
Things I wish I knew before I transitioned to male.
1. That injecting myself with cross-sex hormones actually was harming and damaging my perfectly healthy body. 2. That changing my identity and changing my body wasn't actually going to heal the pain I had within myself. It was just an escape that created actually more trauma for me. 3. That it was okay to be a tomboy and not fit into society's beauty standards of what a woman was supposed to be like. That I was perfect the way I was and I didn't need to change myself.
I started living as a female when I was 19 years old, had a sex change when I was 30 years old. I've now been living as a woman for 28 years, and I fully regret this. First off, my name is Renee Jacks, and I'm an author. I've written 8 books so far, 3 of them to do with transsexuality. I never had the full ability to have intercourse because the vagina that they make is so small. So these surgeries are nothing more than plastic surgery. The sex change didn't solve my discomfort. The doctors who are honest will say that the gender dysphoria is always there. It starts out being about your anatomy, but really what it's, you don't like yourself.
I wanted to give myself time to really explore my feelings and detransition before I shared them with you. This is what I look like. This is what I sound like as an almost 30-year-old man. This is what happens when you let people transition in adolescence before they've had a chance to grow up. Not just let, but pressure. The active pressuring of people to transition so they can preserve their femininity, which is what happened with me. I was told that if I allowed myself to age, that I would become masculine and that it would never be possible and that I would do it anyway. And that I would be a more masculine transgender person like them. And so I made the choices that I thought were right for me at the time. I did it in secret from my parents. I take accountability for all of my choices. But when is the trans community going to take accountability for theirs? For leading me down this path?
I look up right now. It's because I've been sobbing. I was just talking with customer support with my bank. I was calling about some bank stuff. The lady, was super nice. So she called me Mr. Carter, which is, my voice is deep, I get it. I was like, oh, actually it's Miss Carter. And she's like, oh, sorry. And then she just proceeded to call me Carter. But she kept saying sir. And it is accidental, and she didn't correct herself. But at some point during the call, I just started sobbing because, the dysphoria has been a lot lately. I feel so bad because she heard me sobbing and she's like, I'm so sorry. I know how it feels, sir. Ma'am. God. I don't blame her at all.
Thank you very much. Only a few weeks after the attempted attack on a Supreme Court justice on June 25th, one of the witnesses, Alejandra Caraballo, tweeted out the following in response to a decision on abortion overturning Roe v. Wade, and I'll quote directly from the tweet. The 6 justices who overturned Roe should never know peace again. It is our civic duty to accost them every time they're in public. They are pariahs. Since women don't have their rights, these justices should never have a peaceful moment in public again. I know something about being accosted. The night of January 5th, I was physically accosted on the streets of D.C. in Navy Yard by a constituent of mine. I fervently blamed rhetoric on social media, rhetoric at public events, for being physically accosted. I carry a gun everywhere I go when I am in my district and I'm at home, because I know personally that rhetoric has consequences. I've had my car keyed. I've had my house spray painted. I had someone trespass in my house as recently as August. I've been doxxed on social media about where I live. And I've had to add to security everywhere I go. Often, because I can't afford it, I have to carry my own firearm wherever I go. And Alejandra Caraballo also recently tweeted on November 19th, not even a month ago, that the Supreme Court, vested with the judicial power of the United States by our Constitution, stated they are not a legitimate court issuing decisions. And also the Supreme Court is an organ of the far right. So my last question today of Ms. Caraballo, do you stand by these comments, this kind of rhetoric on social media? And do you believe it's a threat to democracy?
Thank you, Representative, for the opportunity to clarify and provide context to my tweets.
I have a question. Is it yes or no? Do you believe your rhetoric is a threat to democracy when you're calling to accost a branch of government, the Supreme Court?
I don't believe that's a correct characterization
What
of
you
my
tweeted,
statements.
though. Did you not tweet that? That you thought that the Supreme Court justices should be accosted?
What I'm
you
saying
tweet
is
that,
that
yes or
that is
no?
not an
Did you tweet
accurate characterization of my statements.
I just wanted to possibly share some advice as an Asian woman in academic spaces that regularly discuss decolonization and some experiences that I have had. Last semester, I took a class called Decolonizing Knowledge, and it was a very diverse class. You had Black people, Black Indigenous people, Asian people, Hispanic, Latina people, white people, etc. Indian people. It was a very diverse group. And there were one or two instances during class discussion. So this is a graduate level seminar. Most of us are in our late 20s, early 30s. And a white man had started to kind of talk over his time, and it wasn't malicious. I've had past classes with him. He's a good friend of mine. He just has a tendency to kind of like overthink and perseverate a bit. And a classmate of mine stepped in and was like, "Hey, so-and-so, I really like everything you had to say. I just want you to be cognizant of the fact that this is a class about decolonizing knowledge, and you were, informed you were about to go over your time, and then by going over the time that you were allotted, you were taking away from the time that people of color's voices could be shared." And he very respectfully was like, "Yeah, I apologize, you're right." And he didn't make a big deal of it, and we all moved on, and it was clear that he absorbed those words from a person of color without making it personal, right? Like, he didn't have a sullen attitude for the rest of the class or in the future. He took it seriously as feedback from a colleague and internalized it. So I know the internet isn't academia, because what I see in academia is just, for the most part, and I know this isn't going to be everyone's experience, but in my experience, there is a general level of respect between everyone in that seminar, because we're all here to do the same thing. We're all here to develop and learn. And the internet's obviously a different place. It's kind of more akin to the Wild West. People in the comments are going to say stuff in a lot meaner way. And I think that as someone who isn't a person of color, if you're coming into these types of spaces and these conversations, you just need to start to expect pushback and kind of a negative response sometimes. Know that sometimes that negative response might come from a place that is not justified, but sometimes it comes from a place that is justified, right? Sometimes it might come in a form that feels unfair. Sometimes it might come in a more nicely wrapped package. But both of those times carry the same value and the same weight and should be internalized in the same way. And I know this is very challenging, because when someone feels like they're being attacked, or I've made this genuine action and people are being mean to me, it does hurt. I completely get that. But I think that there's just a general degree of that you should expect. Know that it doesn't mean you're just unwelcome or cast out of those spaces, but there's going to be an amount of education and empathy that goes into you stepping into spaces that you previously had intentionally neglected stepping into.
The entire journalism industry is basically in a free fall. Today, the Los Angeles Times laid off 115 employees. They wiped out their entire DC bureau in an election year. They laid off pretty much all of their sports teams. They killed their entire tech and business section. They laid off breaking news writers, social media editors. The list goes on. But what's really dark is this is just the latest in months and months and months of layoffs in the media industry. In fact, tens of thousands of journalists have been laid off in the past year. Major media companies like BuzzFeed News have completely shuttered their news operations. Time magazine also just laid off a ton of people, and Sports Illustrated basically shut down last week. Pretty much the entire digital media ecosystem that myself and a lot of other millennial journalists came up in has been completely hollowed out. And it's not just digital media sites. Local news has been obliterated. The newspaper industry is cratering. Radio is essentially dead aside from NPR, which has been gutted. Meanwhile, hundreds of workers at Condé Nast, the parent company of pretty much every major magazine from GQ to Vogue to The New Yorker to Vanity Fair, are on strike because they're also facing impending layoffs. Even mainstream national media outlets owned by billionaires like The Washington Post, where I work, and The Atlantic, where I used to work, have done layoffs. If you're a young journalist today, there's almost no on-ramp to traditional journalism. Even if you do get a job, journalists' salaries have been stagnant and even declined. And by the way, we don't make that much to begin with. I don't think people understand how bad the world would be without journalists. And let me just preface this by saying, for people that don't know my background, I did not go to journalism school. I built my own audience on the internet. I came from outside journalism and started as a blogger, and then entered into legacy journalism, a system that I have been incredibly critical of pretty much my entire career. So I'm definitely not some mainstream media defender. And I think the rise of citizen journalism on apps like TikTok, Instagram, and elsewhere has overwhelmingly been a positive thing. The journalism industry is overrun with elite, underqualified, rich, entitled Nepo babies, okay? And that part of it is terrible. But that's not most journalists. And the majority of journalists losing their jobs in situations like this are the working journalists that are doing these investigations of police brutality, or investigating corporations, or holding power to account, or doing really thoughtful, brilliant cultural commentary. I don't want to live in a world where all of the news is delivered through 60-second TikTok videos with retention editing. And I think there's a ton of really talented journalists that are also just not great like social media people. I think of some of my friends who are journalists who do really deep investigations or local reporting, or sit through hour-long city council meetings to, hold some local politician to account. That's really important work, and it's work that somebody should pay for, and it's work that's not rewarded by these social media algorithms. I would love if everyone could become independent journalists, but the economics are just not there. It's really hard to amass a subscriber base and then retain that subscriber base over time when you're doing investigative work. And that's if you don't get sued out of existence, by the way, after you publish the first critical story of a billionaire. And I will admit, a lot of these traditional media companies have accelerated their own demise. They ignored the internet for years. They're condescending to content creators and people outside their mainstream ecosystem. They constantly kowtow to corporate and political power. They have these false and deluded notions of objectivity, which, by the way, doesn't exist. And they push a lot of really racist, sexist, regressive crap. But that's not even why a lot of them are going out of business. A lot of them are going out of business fundamentally because the economics of the media ecosystem are broken. Most news companies used to monetize by advertising, and those ad dollars have been completely subsumed by Facebook and Google and tech giants. I don't really know where that leads us, other than a pretty dire place where there's really no check on corporate and political power in this country. I did write a lot about this in my book called Extremely Online, but I do think that journalism is something a lot of people won't realize they miss until it's gone.
Hey again. This is a good question. I like this question. Thank you for asking. Why do I need the surgery if I'm already a woman? Well, that's because I was born with a condition that caused me to develop male sex characteristics. And I want to correct as much of that as possible. However, I need to add a great big caveat to this. Genitalia does not define gender. I am a woman because I say that I am a woman. What is or is not between my legs is absolutely irrelevant. Also, I need to state that choosing to get the surgery or not get the surgery is an intensely personal decision. And not all women want to get the surgery. And that is completely and utterly valid. So again, Thanks for asking. Love you.
Dans ce nouveau monde, on doit accepter une transparence, et je dirais même une transparence totale. Tout va être transparent. Et il faut s'habituer, il faut se comporter ainsi. Ça devient, comment dirais-je, intégré dans votre personnalité, mais si on n'a rien à cacher, il ne faut pas avoir peur.